The November fog pressed against the windows of our Baker Street lodgings with unusual persistence that evening, transforming the familiar gaslight into mere suggestions of illumination in the gloom below. I had been absorbed in the evening papers, noting with interest a report on the latest advances in chemical analysis, when I became aware that Holmes had ceased his restless pacing and now stood motionless before the fireplace, his aquiline profile etched sharp against the dancing flames. His grey eyes held that peculiar intensity which I had learned to associate with the approach of an intriguing problem. As if summoned by some preternatural sense, Mrs. Hudson's footsteps echoed on the stairs, followed by the familiar tread of Inspector Lestrade. The Scotland Yard man entered our sitting room bearing the unmistakable air of professional bafflement, his weathered features drawn with exhaustion and his usually immaculate uniform showing signs of a long and trying day. "Mr. Holmes," he began without preamble, "I find myself confronted with circumstances that defy every principle of criminal investigation I have learned in 20 years of service. We have a death that appears to be murder, yet no murderer could have committed it, a locked room that yields no secrets, and a victim whose final moments seem to mock the very laws of nature." Holmes turned from the fire, his lips curving into that slight smile which indicated his professional interest had been thoroughly aroused. "Pray be seated, Lestrade, and favor us with the particulars. Watson, perhaps you would be so good as to pour our guest some brandy. He appears to have encountered something rather more stimulating than the usual run of Whitechapel robberies." "The victim," Lestrade continued, accepting the glass with evident gratitude, "is one Professor Cornelius Blackwood, known throughout the scientific community as the Alchemist Who Never Slept. He maintained a private laboratory in Deo, Dorset Street, where he pursued researches of a most esoteric nature. His landlord, growing concerned at the absence of any sound or movement for over 24 hours, summoned us to force entry to his quarters." "And what did you discover?" Watson inquired, setting down his medical journal with growing interest. "The professor was found seated at his workbench, apparently dead for some considerable time, yet showing no signs of violence or obvious cause of death. The room was secured from within, door bolted, windows latched, chimney flue blocked with waxed cloth. Most peculiar of all, a canary in its cage had also perished, while strange crystalline deposits covered much of the laboratory floor. The lower portions of the window glass bore greasy smears, as though something had condensed upon them." Holmes had moved to his chair and now sat with his fingertips pressed together, his eyes closed in concentration. "The temporal aspects, Lestrade. When did death occur, and what evidence exists of the professor's final activities?" "According to our surgeon, death occurred sometime before 2 o'clock yesterday morning. Yet we have discovered a letter in the professor's hand, posted at the Shoreditch office and bearing a 215 stamp. The postmaster confirms it was delivered by the professor himself." "Fascinating," Holmes murmured, his eyes opening with that peculiar gleam I knew so well. "A man who apparently posted correspondence after his own demise. And you found no indication of how death occurred?" "None whatsoever. No poison bottle, no weapon, no signs of struggle. The room was warm despite the extinguished burners, and there was a strange metallic odor that seemed to cling to everything. The professor's strongbox remains locked, and his assistant, Peters, can offer no explanation for these extraordinary circumstances." Holmes rose abruptly, reaching for his coat and hat. "Come, Watson. The fog will provide excellent cover for our investigation, and I confess myself most eager to examine this laboratory, where time itself appears to have been murdered alongside our unfortunate alchemist. Lestrade, you have presented us with a problem worthy of our immediate attention." As we prepared to venture into the London night, I could not suppress a familiar thrill of anticipation. Once again, the game was afoot. The hansom cab carried us eastward through fog so dense it seemed to muffle not only sound but thought itself, transforming the familiar streets of London into an ethereal maze of spectral gas lamps and shadowed doorways. Holmes sat in contemplative silence, broken only once, when he observed to our driver that the man had recently served aboard a merchant vessel. A deduction he drew from the particular knot, securing the man's muffler and the distinctive weathering of his hands. As we approached Dorset Street, the fog seemed to thicken further, as though the very atmosphere conspired to shroud the mystery that awaited us. The building that housed Professor Blackwood's laboratory stood like a grimy monument to London's industrial ambitions, its soot-stained bricks weeping moisture in the November chill. Lestrade led us up 3 flights of creaking stairs, past curious residents who whispered in doorways about the strange death above. The laboratory door bore the brutal scars of forced entry, its heavy oak panels splintered around the lock mechanism where the police had broken through. As we crossed the threshold, I was immediately struck by the peculiar atmosphere that permeated the chamber, a metallic tang mingled with chemical residues and something else I could not readily identify. Holmes paused in the doorway, his nostrils flaring slightly as he absorbed what he would later call the olfactory evidence. Most instructive, Watson. Note how the various scents layer themselves according to their molecular weight and the time of their introduction to the environment. The laboratory itself was a testament to obsessive scientific pursuit. Glass apparatus of every conceivable design lined the walls, retorts, alembics, condensers, and devices whose purpose I could only guess at. At the room's center stood the workbench, where Professor Blackwood had met his end. The deceased alchemist slumped forward over scattered papers covered with complex formulae, his grey beard trailing across his final calculations. Holmes moved with the fluid precision of a master craftsman examining another's work. He first approached the shattered door, studying not the obvious damage but the intact portions, using his penknife to tease from the baseboard a filament so fine it quivered in the draught. With a visiting card serving as an impromptu spoon, he lifted a pinch of the white crystalline deposits that covered much of the floor, breathing upon the sample and watching it bloom into a brief cloud before settling again in glittering fragments. Sal ammoniac, I ventured, recognizing the chemical from my medical training. Just so, Watson, he replied, but his attention had already shifted to the dead canary in its ornate cage. He inhaled delicately near the small corpse and shook his head. No almond scent, not prussic acid, then. Moving to the windows, Holmes examined the greasy smears that marked the lower panes, measuring with his hand the height of the stains and noting how they concentrated near the floor. Heavy vapors are poor climbers, he murmured. Observe where they take and where they leave off. The waxed cloth that had blocked the chimney flue came away with a sigh of stale heat. Its inner face filmed white, while the outer surface bore a faint, greasy residue marked with what appeared to be a broad thumbprint. I approached the body with my medical training in mind, noting the absence of obvious trauma, but observing certain peculiarities. His fingernails showed distinct discoloration. Holmes A. Greenish tinge suggesting copper compound exposure. Yet note also the slight cherry-red coloration to his skin and the dilated pupils. These symptoms might indicate carbon monoxide poisoning, though I cannot fathom how such exposure occurred in a room with adequate ventilation. Holmes had turned his attention to the professor's final work, studying a notebook that lay open beneath the dead man's hand. The tight script concluded in a blot after the word calcination, while the victim's cuffs showed small, crescent-shaped burns. A young man with sandy lashes stepped forward at Holmes's gesture. Josiah Peters. Sir, the professor's assistant. I left at 11:15 yesterday evening. Professor Blackwood was writing to Lady Euphemia about funding for new equipment. He mentioned needing to catch the Shoreditch post before it closed. Lestrade produced the mysterious letter, posted at 2:15 in the morning. Holmes examined it carefully, holding it to the light and breathing upon the flap. Your ink, Watson? He asked, indicating the pen beside the body. Violet, I replied. Yet the envelope flap shows iron gall ink, Holmes murmured thoughtfully. He crouched near the door, where the dust showed a thin, curved sweep, as from the passage of a line drawn taut and then released. Standing in complete immobility for several moments, his head tilted as though listening to some inner voice, Holmes finally turned to us, with that familiar gleam of intellectual triumph in his eyes. "Inspector, leave everything precisely as you found it. Mr. Peters, remain within call. Watson, we shall visit the Shoreditch postmaster at dawn and call upon Lady Euphemia before luncheon. There is here a sequence contrived to appear inevitable, but I suspect it has been written backward. Let us endeavour to read it the proper way round." Dawn found us at the Shoreditch post office as the first clerks arrived through the thinning fog, their breath forming small clouds in the bitter morning air. Holmes had spent the intervening hours in what he termed cerebral housekeeping, sitting motionless in his chair while tobacco smoke wreathed his angular features. I had learned not to disturb him during these periods of intense mental activity, though the urge to inquire about his conclusions tested my patience sorely. The postmaster, a thin gentleman named Carruthers, whose ink-stained cuff spoke of long hours at his ledgers, greeted us with the nervous deference that Holmes's reputation invariably inspired. "Indeed, Mr. Holmes, most peculiar circumstances surround that particular posting. Professor Blackwood arrived precisely at 2:15, though he appeared greatly altered from his usual demeanour." "In what manner altered?" Holmes inquired, his grey eyes fixed upon the man with penetrating intensity. "He moved with unusual deliberation, sir, as though each step required considerable effort. His clothing was dishevelled, and he wore spectacles with smoky lenses, most unusual for the hour. There was an odd quality to his voice, hoarse and whispering, and his hands were encased in India rubber gloves that left a greasy smear upon my counter." Carruthers indicated a dark stain on the wood. When I remarked upon the lateness of the hour, he merely nodded and departed without his customary pleasantries. His eyes seemed unseeing, despite being open rather like a sleepwalker, if you take my meaning. Holmes examined the postal register with meticulous care, noting the tremor in the signature's final letters, while the initial stroke maintained its characteristic boldness. He bent to smell the stain on the counter, his nostrils flaring slightly. "Oil of vitriol and mercury salts," he murmured to me, most instructive. Our subsequent journey to Lady Euphemia Ashford's Belgravia residence revealed a woman of formidable intellect housed within the elegant frame of advancing years. Her drawing-room, adorned with scientific instruments and first editions, provided a backdrop for her sharp blue eyes and silver hair arranged with mathematical precision. Professor Blackwood was a genius, Mr. Holmes, though perhaps not entirely stable in his later years, she began, her voice surprisingly strong. His correspondence had grown increasingly erratic, filled with references to experiments that bordered upon the fantastical. This final letter, however, struck me as particularly urgent. She produced the mysterious missive, which Holmes read aloud. "My dear Lady Euphemia, I write in haste as time grows short. The great work approaches completion. But I fear I have attracted unwanted attention from my former colleague. Should anything befall me, know that the secret lies in the marriage of opposites, where fire meets ice, where consciousness embraces oblivion. The final calcination proceeds as planned. Your devoted colleague, C. Blackwood." "Former colleague?" I inquired, noting how her fingers worried the lace of her sleeve. "Dr. Mortimer Vance, formerly the professor's closest collaborator until they suffered a bitter falling out over theoretical differences. Mortimer believed that Cornelius had become too obsessed with what he called the vigilant principle, a process for maintaining human consciousness indefinitely without sleep. Mortimer dismissed this as impossible, leading to harsh words and complete severance of their partnership." Holmes had risen, and now stood examining a photograph upon the mantelpiece, showing Lady Euphemia with several distinguished gentlemen in academic robes, and Dr. Vance's current circumstances. He maintains a laboratory in Whitechapel, pursuing his own research into chemical stimulants. 3 days ago, Cornelius claimed someone had been observing his laboratory from the building opposite always at the stroke of midnight. He was convinced it was Mortimer, attempting to steal his discoveries. As we prepared to take our leave, Lady Euphemia grasped Holmes's sleeve with surprising strength. Mr. Holmes, I fear that Cornelius may have stumbled upon something genuinely dangerous. His experiments involved what he called white fire substances that could accelerate natural processes beyond normal limits. If someone wished him harm, they would not have needed conventional weapons. The fog had lifted during our visit, revealing a London washed clean by the night's moisture. Holmes walked in thoughtful silence until we reached Piccadilly, where he suddenly stopped and turned to me with that expression of barely contained excitement that invariably preceded his most brilliant deductions. "Watson, we must locate Dr. Mortimer Vance immediately. Our alchemist discovered something far more significant than the transmutation of base metals. He found a way to compress the very essence of time itself, and someone killed him for it." Our journey to Whitechapel carried us through London's stark transformation from the polished elegance of Belgravia to the grimy industrial heart of the East End, where the morning sun struggled to penetrate the perpetual haze of coal smoke and chemical vapors. Holmes maintained his contemplative silence during the cab ride, though I observed him repeatedly examining his pocket watch and making small notations in his leather journal. The rhythmic clatter of wheels on cobblestones seemed to match the urgency that now drove our investigation forward. Dr. Mortimer Vance's laboratory occupied the ground floor of a narrow building wedged between a leather goods factory and a gin distillery, its windows blackened with soot and residue. The brass nameplate beside the door bore the simple inscription, M. Vance, Chemical Research, though the lettering had grown tarnished with age. Holmes paused before entering, his keen eyes noting the fresh scratches around the lock mechanism and examining the door frame with that peculiar intensity I had learned to associate with significant discoveries. The interior revealed a workspace that contrasted sharply with Professor Blackwood's orderly laboratory. Here, apparatus lay scattered across multiple tables in apparent chaos, though I suspected the arrangement followed some logic comprehensible only to its owner. Glass vessels containing liquids of various hues lined the walls, while the air carried the sharp bite of acids mixed with more exotic compounds that made my eyes water slightly. Dr. Vance himself proved to be a man of perhaps 50 years, his once dark hair now streaked with premature grey, and his hands bearing the permanent stains of chemical pursuits. His eyes, magnified behind thick spectacles, held the intense focus of the dedicated researcher, though I detected an underlying nervousness as he greeted us. A smoky lens visor lay beside his workbench, and I noticed how his fingers trembled slightly as he gestured for us to be seated. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, your reputation precedes you," he began, his voice carrying a reedy quality. "I assume your visit concerns poor Cornelius, a tragic loss to the scientific community, though I confess his recent work had grown increasingly erratic." Holmes leaned forward, his fingers steepled in that characteristic pose. "Indeed, Dr. Vance. Lady Euphemia mentioned a falling out between you regarding his theoretical pursuits. Something about the vigilant principle?" A shadow crossed Vance's features, and he turned to adjust the flame beneath a bubbling retort. Cornelius became obsessed with maintaining human consciousness indefinitely through chemical intervention. He claimed to have discovered compounds that could accelerate mental processes while sustaining physical functions without natural sleep. For months, he required no rest whatsoever, spending entire weeks in his laboratory. I considered such theories not merely impossible, but dangerous. Dangerous in what manner? I inquired, noting the pale yellow staining between his thumb and forefinger. "Because he was testing these compounds upon himself, Dr. Watson." His letters became increasingly incoherent, filled with references to white fire and temporal compression. When I attempted to reason with him, he accused me of seeking to steal his discoveries. Vance's agitation was becoming more apparent. 3 nights ago, I witnessed strange flashes of brilliant white light from his windows at precisely midnight. The following evening, the night of his death, I observed him leaving his laboratory at 2:30 in the morning. Holmes's eyes sharpened with interest. "You were watching his laboratory?" "Aye. was concerned for his safety, Vance insisted, his voice rising slightly. His movements seemed mechanical, puppet-like. He walked directly to the Shoreditch post office, completed some business, and returned. I lost sight of him when he entered the building, but no lights appeared thereafter. "And your own whereabouts during these crucial hours?" Holmes asked mildly, though his gaze had fixed upon the crystalline particles I now noticed clinging to Vance's cuffs. "I was here in my laboratory, working on alkaloid synthesis. My assistant, Timothy Marsh, remained with me until nearly 3 o'clock. Despite our differences, Mr. Holmes, I held nothing but concern for Cornelius's welfare." Holmes rose and moved toward the window, gazing across the narrow street. "Tell me, Dr. Vance, what occurs when sal ammoniac is heated in the presence of metallic mercury, particularly in an enclosed space?" The question struck Vance like a physical blow. His face drained of color, and for a moment his composure cracked entirely. That is, such combinations are highly theoretical." "Indeed," Holmes murmured, his gray eyes holding that peculiar gleam of triumph. "Most theoretical. Come, Watson, we have learned what we came to discover." As we departed, I could feel Vance's stricken gaze following us into the London morning. The moment we departed, Dr. Vance's laboratory, Holmes seized my arm with such urgency that I nearly stumbled on the uneven cobblestones. His gray eyes blazed with that familiar intensity that marked the approach of revelation, though his expression remained grimly focused rather than triumphant. "Watson, we must return to Dorset Street immediately. Dr. Vance's reaction to my chemical inquiry has confirmed certain suspicions, but there remains crucial evidence I failed to examine with sufficient care during our initial investigation." Our hansom cab navigated the crowded thoroughfares with maddening deliberation, though Holmes utilized the journey to elaborate upon the scientific principles that now occupied his thoughts. "Consider the properties of sal ammoniac when heated in proximity to metallic mercury. My dear fellow, the reaction produces not merely toxic vapors, but creates what our late professor might have termed white fire, a process that consumes available oxygen while generating both carbon monoxide and peculiar metallic compounds that affect human consciousness." Upon reaching Professor Blackwood's building, we found Lestrade awaiting us with evident impatience, his weathered features bearing that expression of professional frustration I had grown to recognize. Holmes brushed past the inspector without ceremony, his attention immediately drawn to details that had previously escaped our notice. Kneeling beside the workbench, he examined with his magnifying glass a series of minute perforations in the wooden surface, each hole containing fragments of what appeared to be fine copper wire bearing traces of white crystalline residue. "Most ingenious," Holmes murmured, his voice carrying a note of grudging admiration for the killer's technical skill. "Our murderer possessed considerable knowledge of both chemistry and mechanical engineering." To the chimney flue. He removed the waxed cloth entirely, revealing that its inner surface bore multiple distinct thumbprints, overlapping in a manner suggesting repeated handling over several days. With methodical precision, Holmes reconstructed the laboratory's final moments, positioning himself at various points throughout the room and measuring distances with his arms extended. The crystalline deposits formed distinct patterns across the floor, while the greasy window smears concentrated at specific heights that corresponded to what he termed vapor density stratification. At the dead canary's cage, he observed how the bird's position aligned precisely with the primary concentration point of the lethal gases. "The beauty of this crime, Watson, lies in its exploitation of the victim's own experimental obsessions," Holmes explained, his fingers tracing the peculiar burn marks on Professor Blackwood's cuffs. Our alchemist was indeed pursuing his vigilant principle, chemical maintenance of consciousness without natural sleep. But his killer transformed this very research into an instrument of murder. Holmes had moved to examine the door's interior surface, where I now noticed a thin groove running from floor to ceiling, barely visible unless viewed from the precise angle. Using his penknife, He extracted from this channel a length of catgut so fine it appeared almost invisible, its surface bearing the same greasy residue we had observed elsewhere. The final mechanism, he announced with satisfaction. A wire system that allowed our murderer to manipulate the door's bolt from outside the sealed room, creating the perfect appearance of suicide while maintaining an unassailable alibi. He demonstrated how the device would function, showing how the catgut could draw the bolt while leaving no trace of external interference. As the full implications of Holmes's deductions crystallized, I felt a chill that penetrated beyond the sand, November air. But such elaborate preparation suggests intimate knowledge of the professor's habits, his research, and his personal vulnerabilities. Precisely, Watson. Our killer understood not only Blackwood's scientific pursuits, but could predict his movements with mathematical precision. Someone who had observed him closely, learned his routines, and possessed both the chemical knowledge and mechanical skill to construct this elaborate death trap. Holmes straightened, his expression hardening with purpose. Come, we must locate Timothy Marsh before he realizes how thoroughly his carefully constructed deception has been exposed. The urgency in Holmes's voice galvanized both Lestrade and myself into immediate action, though the inspector's bewilderment was evident as we hastened back toward Whitechapel through streets now bustling with afternoon commerce. Holmes maintained a grim silence during our journey, his fingers drumming against his knee in that restless pattern. I had learned to associate with cases approaching their critical juncture. The revelation that Timothy Marsh represented our true quarry had transformed what appeared to be a conflict between former colleagues into something far more sinister and calculated. Upon reaching Dr. Vance's laboratory, we found the establishment eerily quiet, its windows darkened despite the early hour. Holmes's sharp rap upon the door echoed through the narrow street, but no response came from within. Lestrade produced his official keys, though Holmes had already begun examining the lock mechanism with that peculiar intensity that marked his most focused investigations. Forced from within, he announced grimly, indicating fresh scratches around the interior bolt mechanism. Our bird appears to have flown, though not without leaving certain traces of his hasty departure. The laboratory's interior revealed signs of violent struggle and hurried evacuation. Chemical apparatus lay overturned, their contents creating noxious puddles across the wooden floor, while papers scattered near the fireplace bore the charred edges of interrupted destruction. Most alarming of all, we discovered Dr. Vance himself in a small storage room, bound with laboratory tubing and bearing the marks of recent violence. Though conscious, the older man appeared severely shaken, his spectacles cracked, and his usual composure entirely shattered. As we freed him from his restraints, his words tumbled forth in a torrent of fear and revelation. Timothy arrived this morning in a state of complete agitation, Vance gasped, accepting the brandy I offered from Holmes's flask. He claimed you had discovered his involvement in Cornelius's death, though I could scarcely credit such accusations. When I pressed him for details, he became violent, insisting that I had betrayed him despite our alibi arrangement. Holmes knelt beside the shaken chemist, his voice gentle but insistent. Dr. Vance, I require absolute honesty regarding your assistant's activities. What precisely was the nature of your relationship with young Marsh? He came to me 6 months ago, claiming to be a student of advanced chemistry seeking practical experience. His knowledge was extensive, particularly regarding metallic compounds and vapor dynamics. I welcomed his assistance, especially since my correspondence with Cornelius had grown so acrimonious. Vance's hands trembled as he continued. Timothy showed particular interest in Cornelius's research, often asking detailed questions about his former colleague's experimental methods and theoretical pursuits. Holmes had moved to examine the scattered evidence of Marsh's experiments. Near the overturned workbench, he discovered a leather journal whose pages contained detailed observations of Professor Blackwood's daily routines, recorded with the methodical precision of extended surveillance. A nearly empty reel marked catgut lay beside coils of fine copper wire, while glass tubes containing residues of various compounds bore traces of the distinctive white crystalline substance we had observed in Professor Blackwood's laboratory. "Listen to this, Watson," Holmes said, reading from the journal's final entries. November 10th. Subject maintains vigil until precisely 2:15, then departs for postal duties. Chemical apparatus remains active throughout absence, suggesting automated processes. November 11th. Observed subject's increasing disorientation. Physical coordination deteriorating despite maintained consciousness. Opportunity approaching for final implementation. Rising with sudden decision, Holmes turned toward us with that expression of barely contained intellectual excitement. "Gentlemen, the mechanism becomes clear. Young Marsh exploited Professor Blackwood's own security measures, the tripwires and alarm systems the professor had installed to protect his research. By introducing the catgut system through these existing threads, Marsh could manipulate the door's bolt from outside while the victim remained sealed within his own laboratory, breathing the toxic vapors generated by his compromised experiments." "But his whereabouts during the crucial hours?" Lestrade inquired. "A carefully constructed alibi involving his supposed presence here until 3 o'clock, while in reality he departed at midnight to implement his deadly mechanism, returning before dawn to establish his false timeline." As we prepared to resume our pursuit, Holmes's expression hardened with purpose. Timothy Marsh possesses both the knowledge and desperation to attempt another such crime. We must locate him before he disappears entirely into London's vast anonymity. Holmes's words galvanized us into immediate action, though his next move surprised both Lestrade and myself. Rather than pursuing Marsh through London's labyrinthine streets, he led us directly across from Professor Blackwood's laboratory to the narrow building that housed the very rooms from which the professor had believed himself watched. The sour-tempered landlady, Mrs. Keene, protested our intrusion until Lestrade's official card and Holmes's imperious manner combined to loosen both her tongue and her reluctant cooperation. "The young gentleman in the garret has paid through the month," she grumbled, leading us up creaking stairs that bore the accumulated grime of decades. Quiet as a mouse, he was, though I did notice him coming and going at the strangest hours. Always carried that leather satchel, and his hands bore the permanent stains of someone who worked with chemicals. Holmes paused at the 4th step, noting a worn edge and examining with his magnifying glass a spot of greasy discoloration upon the banister. At the topmost landing, he halted before a garret door whose lock showed unmistakable signs of recent and repeated use. The chamber within revealed the methodical preparations of extended surveillance, a packing crate serving as a table, a single chair positioned with mathematical precision, and most tellingly, a circular aperture cut through the window sash with surgical accuracy. The whole, no greater in diameter than a crown piece, aligned like a marksman's sight directly upon Professor Blackwood's workbench across the narrow street. Upon the makeshift table lay the very spectacles with smoky lenses that the postmaster had described, alongside India rubber gloves bearing that distinctive metallic residue. A bottle of iron gall ink sat beside a sheaf of envelopes addressed in Blackwood's characteristic hand, though I observed how the initial letters maintained their boldness while the final strokes grew increasingly tremulous. "Our Phantom of Shoreditch," Holmes murmured, examining the spectacles with evident admiration for their wearer's cunning. He could observe without being observed, and more significantly, he practiced writing, the professor's posthumous correspondence, until he could replicate even the effects of the victim's deteriorating motor control. Watson moved to the window, peering through the aperture toward the sealed laboratory. "But surely Marsh has fled London entirely by now. Why return to this surveillance post when his crime has been discovered?" Holmes's grey eyes held that peculiar gleam of intellectual certainty that marked his most confident deductions. "Because, my dear fellow, our Mr. Marsh is not a common criminal motivated by mere survival. He is a fanatic driven by intellectual avarice, a man who murdered not for gold, but for knowledge itself. Consider his months of patient observation, his elaborate mechanical preparations, his intimate study of Professor Blackwood's research methods. Such dedication springs from obsession, not opportunism. Moving to examine the scattered papers more closely, Holmes continued his analysis with that methodical precision I had learned to admire. Marsh invested too much cunning and assumed too much risk to abandon his ultimate objective now. Professor Blackwood's strongbox remains in the laboratory, sealed and presumably containing the formulae for the vigilant principle that drove our alchemist to such dangerous experimentation. Marsh will assume that Scotland Yard, baffled by the apparent impossibility of the locked-room murder, will have secured the scene, but failed to comprehend the true significance of Blackwood's final research. Lestrade shifted uncomfortably in the cramped space. "You believe he will return to the laboratory itself?" "I am certain of it," Holmes replied, producing from his waistcoat a small mechanical device of intricate construction. "Our quarry possesses the key to Professor Blackwood's private entrance, the very key he used to implement his murderous mechanism. He will return under cover of darkness, confident in his ability to retrieve the research that represents the fruits of his elaborate crime." Holmes spent the next hour in careful preparation, examining every detail of the surveillance chamber while explaining his reasoning. Marsh's psychological profile suggests a man of methodical habits who plans extensively but adapts poorly to unexpected circumstances. His surveillance journal demonstrates obsessive attention to routine and timing. Such individuals, when cornered, retreat to familiar territory and established patterns. As dusk settled over London, transforming the city into a chiaroscuro of gaslight and shadow, Holmes positioned us strategically throughout the area. He had discovered that the garret's position provided perfect observation of both the laboratory's main entrance and the narrow alley that housed its secondary access. With Lestrade concealed near the street entrance and myself stationed to observe the rear approach, Holmes took his position at the circular aperture that had served Marsh's surveillance so well. "The irony is quite elegant, Watson," he observed, adjusting the focus of his own opera glasses. "We shall use the hunter's own blind to observe his return to the scene of his triumph. Marsh believes himself the master of this particular game, but he has underestimated the very persistence and methodical nature that enabled his initial success." The hours passed with agonizing slowness, marked only by the distant sounds of London's evening commerce gradually giving way to the deeper quiet of night. Holmes remained motionless at his post, his aquiline profile etched against the faint light from the street below, while I found myself studying the meticulous evidence of Marsh's extended preparation. The young man's dedication to his murderous purpose was both impressive and deeply disturbing. At precisely midnight, Holmes's posture suddenly tensed. "There," he whispered, his voice carrying that note of satisfaction that marked the successful conclusion of his deductive reasoning. "Our alchemist, who never slept, returns to claim his prize." Through the circular aperture, a slight figure emerged from the alley's shadows, moving with the calculated precision of someone intimately familiar with his surroundings. Timothy Marsh approached Professor Blackwood's rear entrance, his leather satchel clutched against his chest like a shield, his movements betraying both confidence and barely contained desperation. The India rubber gloves gleamed faintly in the gaslight as he produced a key and worked at the lock with practiced efficiency. Holmes's breathing grew imperceptibly quieter, his body coiled with predatory tension. Through subtle hand signals, he coordinated our positions. Lestrade at the front entrance, myself covering the alley, while he maintained observation from our elevated vantage point. The laboratory's darkened windows suddenly flickered with the brief illumination of a covered lantern as Marsh navigated the familiar interior with methodical purpose. "He proceeds directly to his objective," Holmes whispered, his grey eyes never leaving the moving light below. "Observe how he avoids the areas where chemical residues might betray his presence, yet moves with the assurance of someone who has rehearsed this precise sequence." The lantern's beam concentrated near the workbench where Professor Blackwood had died, then shifted toward what appeared to be a section of solid wall. Marsh's movements grew more purposeful as he discovered some concealed mechanism, causing a hidden panel to swing inward on silent hinges. The strongbox lay within this secret compartment, its brass fittings catching the light as he lifted it with evident satisfaction. Holmes rose with fluid grace, his hand closing upon my shoulder. "Come, Watson. Our quarry has claimed his prize, but the game is far from concluded." We descended the creaking stairs with careful haste, Holmes pausing only to signal Lestrade through the outer, front window. As we reached the building's rear access, the sound of Marsh's exit came as expected, cautious footsteps upon the cobblestones, the soft scraping of the door closing behind him. Holmes stepped from concealment as Marsh advanced into the alley, his service revolver trained upon the fugitive with unwavering precision. "Mr. Timothy Marsh, I believe you carry something that belongs to the estate of Professor Cornelius Blackwood." Marsh froze in the lantern's dim glow, the strongbox clutched defensively against his chest. His face, when he turned toward us, bore the desperate expression of someone whose elaborate plans had crumbled into ruin, yet beneath the fear lurked a calculating intelligence that suggested he might attempt some final gambit. "You understand nothing of what that madman discovered," Marsh said, his voice carrying both defiance and desperation. "The knowledge within this box could revolutionize human consciousness itself." Indeed, Holmes replied, his tone carrying that note of quiet authority that brooked no resistance. "And you murdered him for it, through an ingenious exploitation of his own research. The locked room mystery that baffled Scotland Yard was achieved through your catgut mechanism, threaded through the professor's existing security wires, allowing you to manipulate the door's bolt from outside while maintaining your alibi." Lestrade emerged from the shadows, blocking any escape route, while I positioned myself to prevent desperate flight. Marsh's composure began to crack as Holmes continued his methodical reconstruction. "Your surveillance from the garret provided intimate knowledge of Blackwood's habits, enabling you to introduce sal ammoniac into his laboratory apparatus. When heated with the mercury compounds he was already using for his vigilant principle experiments, it created a lethal atmosphere of carbon monoxide and volatile mercury vapors. The professor's obsession with maintaining consciousness without sleep made him the perfect victim for his own research. The postmaster's account of the 2:15 posting was your masterstroke," I added, understanding flooding through me. "You impersonated the dying professor, using his disorientation from chemical poisoning to manipulate him into posting that final letter, creating the illusion that death occurred after the documented time." Marsh's defiance crumbled entirely as the full scope of his exposed deception became clear. "He stole from Dr. Vance," he whispered, his final justification sounding hollow even to himself. "I merely sought to restore proper credit. You sought to claim genius that was never yours," Holmes replied coldly as Lestrade moved forward with the handcuffs. "Your meticulous planning revealed a clerk's mind, not an innovator's vision." The metallic click of the restraints echoed through the narrow alley, sealing the fate of the man who had transformed scientific ambition into calculated murder. Yet as we led him away, I noticed Holmes's expression remained troubled, suggesting that even this masterful capture had not entirely satisfied his exacting standards for complete resolution. The return journey to Baker Street proceeded in contemplative silence, with Marsh secured between two constables, while the recovered strongbox rested upon the seat beside Holmes like a tangible representation of the knowledge that had driven men to both genius and murder. The November fog had lifted during our confrontation, revealing a London washed clean by the night's moisture, though the moral complexities of our case remained as murky as the earlier mist. Mrs. Hudson had maintained our sitting room against the chill, the fire crackling warmly, while gaslight cast familiar shadows across the comfortable furnishings. Holmes placed the strongbox upon our table with ceremonial precision, then stood regarding it with that peculiar intensity that marked his most profound concentrations. Lestrade, still nursing the excitement of successful capture, settled into the chair opposite, with evident satisfaction. "The beauty of Marsh's crime, gentlemen," Holmes began, his fingers working at the brass lock mechanism with practiced efficiency, "lay not merely in its technical ingenuity, but in its profound understanding of human obsession. He exploited Professor Blackwood's own paranoia and security measures to create an illusion of the impossible." The strongbox yielded with a satisfying click, revealing leather-bound journals, sealed vials containing various compounds, and most significantly, a thick manuscript bearing the title, "The Vigilant Principle: Theoretical Foundations and Practical Applications." Holmes examined each item with methodical care, his grey eyes reflecting the firelight as understanding crystallized. "The locked room mechanism was elegantly simple," he continued, producing from the evidence a length of the catgut we had discovered. Marsh threaded this through Blackwood's existing security wires. The very tripwires meant to protect the laboratory became instruments of imprisonment. From his garret surveillance post, he could manipulate the door's bolt after the professor entered, sealing him within his own sanctuary. The dust sweep we observed on the laboratory floor marked where this taut line was drawn and released. I leaned forward, fascinated despite the grim subject matter. But surely the mechanism would leave traces. Under normal circumstances, yes, under normal circumstances. However, when the police forced entry, the catgut would have snapped under tension or been pulled free, leaving no obvious evidence. The professor's own security became his prison. Holmes lifted one of the sealed vials, noting its crystalline contents. The murder itself was achieved through chemical manipulation. Marsh introduced sal ammoniac into Blackwood's experimental apparatus. When heated alongside the mercury compounds already in use for the Vigilant Principle research, it created a lethal atmosphere of carbon monoxide and mercury vapor. "The cherry-red skin coloration," I observed, my medical training providing context. "Precisely, Watson. The carbon monoxide poisoning, while the green discoloration of the fingernails indicated mercury exposure, the metallic odor that permeated the laboratory, the dead canary serving as an unwitting sentinel, all evidence of this toxic combination. Blackwood's obsession with maintaining consciousness without sleep made him prolong his exposure far beyond what any normal person would endure." Lestrade shifted uncomfortably. "Ah, and the postal mystery?" Holmes smiled grimly, producing the spectacles with smoky lenses from the evidence collection. Marsh, masterstroke of misdirection. He had observed Blackwood's deteriorating condition from his surveillance post, noting how the chemical compounds caused disorientation and mechanical movements. The postmaster's description of the professor's altered appearance, the deliberate movements, the hoarse voice, the unseeing eyes, these were Marsh impersonating a chemically debilitated man. "The ink provided the crucial evidence," I added, understanding flooding through me. Blackwood used violet ink habitually, yet the posthumous letter bore traces of iron gall ink. Exactly. Marsh, in his careful preparation, overlooked this detail. His forgery of Blackwood's increasingly tremulous handwriting was otherwise perfect, replicating even the effects of mercury poisoning on motor control. Holmes closed the manuscript with evident distaste. "The tragedy, gentlemen, is that Marsh possessed genuine brilliance. His surveillance journal demonstrated advanced knowledge of chemistry and mechanical engineering that exceeded mere assistance." The fire crackled in the ensuing silence as we contemplated the intricate web of obsession, theft, and murder that had driven these events. Holmes stood before the mantelpiece, his aquiline profile etched sharp against the dancing flames. "Yet, questions remain," he murmured, his voice carrying that note of unfinished business that I had learned to recognize. Marsh's emotional response suggested grievances deeper than mere intellectual envy. His claim regarding stolen credit may possess more substance than desperate justification. As if summoned by Holmes's prescient observation, "Mrs. Hudson's footsteps echoed on the stairs, followed by urgent knocking that promised further revelations in our already complex case. The urgent knocking proved to herald Lady Euphemia's return, though her usual composed demeanor had given way to evident agitation that spoke of disturbing discoveries. She entered our sitting room bearing a leather portfolio clutched against her chest, her silver hair slightly disheveled, and her sharp blue eyes blazing with righteous indignation. "Mr. Holmes, forgive the intrusion at this hour, but my solicitor has forwarded documents that cast your investigation in an entirely different light," she began, settling into the chair I offered, while Holmes regarded her with that penetrating attention he reserved for crucial revelations. "The private fund I established to support Professor Blackwood's research has been systematically plundered through forged authorizations payments drawn not only by the professor himself, but by Dr. Mortimer Vance and, most significantly, substantial sums delivered monthly to one Timothy Marsh over the past 5 months." Holmes accepted the financial records with evident satisfaction, his grey eyes scanning the meticulous documentation while Lestrade leaned forward with renewed professional interest. The bank drafts revealed a pattern of coordinated deception that transformed our understanding of the crime's true scope and motivation. "Most illuminating, Lady Euphemia," Holmes murmured, noting the dates and amounts with characteristic precision. "These payments to Marsh began precisely when his surveillance of Professor Blackwood commenced, while Dr. Vance's withdrawals increased substantially during the same period. Inspector, did you not mention that Dr. Vance awaits questioning at the Yard?" "Indeed, Mr. Holmes. I took the liberty of requesting his attendance after his initial statement proved incomplete." Lestrade's expression hardened with the realization that their investigation had uncovered a conspiracy, rather than a simple murder. Within the quarter hour, Dr. Vance arrived under police escort, his earlier composure entirely evaporated and replaced by the haunted expression of a man whose carefully constructed deceptions had crumbled beyond repair. His hands trembled as he removed his hat, and I observed how he avoided meeting Lady Euphemia's accusatory gaze. "Mortimer," she said, her voice carrying the weight of betrayed trust, "you have stolen from the fund intended to advance legitimate scientific research in order to finance murder." "I never intended murder," Vance protested, though his voice lacked conviction. Marsh represented himself as seeking only to document Blackwood's declining mental state and recover research that had been improperly appropriated. Holmes had moved to examine the evidence with renewed purpose, his deductive faculties now operating with the additional context that Lady Euphemia's revelations provided. "Dr. Vance, your protestations of innocent intention ring hollow when examined against the physical evidence. The waxed cloth that sealed Professor Blackwood's chimney flue bears your thumbprint broad and distinctive, quite unlike the professor's narrow digits. The crystalline residue on your cuffs when we first met was sal ammoniac, the very compound used to create the lethal atmosphere in Blackwood's laboratory. Furthermore," Holmes continued, his voice carrying that note of inexorable logic that marked his most devastating deductions, "your reaction to my inquiry about mercury and sal ammoniac combinations revealed intimate knowledge of their toxic properties. Most tellingly, the knots used to bind you in your laboratory bore the precise double throws favored by experienced chemists, not the crude work of a panicked youth, but the careful staging of someone seeking to appear victimized." Vance's composure cracked entirely under Holmes's methodical analysis. "You understand nothing of what Blackwood had become," he said desperately. His appropriation of younger colleagues' research had grown systematic and shameless. Timothy Marsh was merely the latest victim, a brilliant student whose early work on cognitive acceleration formed the theoretical foundation of what Blackwood claimed as his own vigilant principle. So, the theft of intellectual property provided motive, I observed, though the revelation did nothing to diminish the crime's calculated nature. Blackwood destroyed promising careers through systematic plagiarism, Vance continued, his voice gaining strength from righteous anger. When Timothy approached me with evidence of this academic fraud, I saw an opportunity for justice. I provided financial support and laboratory access, believing he sought only to document the professor's crimes and recover stolen research. Holmes regarded him with cold assessment. Yet you participated willingly in murder when documentation proved insufficient. The locked room mechanism required your chemical expertise to perfect, while your alibi provided Marsh the freedom to implement his deadly plan. You are not merely an accessory, Dr. Vance. You are a co-conspirator who sought to profit from another's death while maintaining plausible deniability. Lady Euphemia rose with dignified fury. You have perverted legitimate scientific inquiry into an instrument of vengeance, Mortimer. Whatever Cornelius's faults, they did not warrant execution. Lestrade stepped forward with grim satisfaction. Dr. Mortimer Vance, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder and fraud against Lady Euphemia's charitable fund. As the handcuffs closed around Vance's wrists, Holmes turned to address the broader implications of our investigation. The tragedy of this case, Lady Euphemia, lies not merely in Professor Blackwood's death, but in the corruption of scientific pursuit itself. Knowledge stolen through plagiarism became the motive for murder, while legitimate research funds financed elaborate deception. The fire crackled in the ensuing silence as we contemplated the web of academic fraud, intellectual theft, and calculated murder that had driven these tragic events. Holmes stood before the mantelpiece, his aquiline profile etched sharp against the dancing flames. The vigilant principle that cost Professor Blackwood his life may indeed have contained genuine scientific value, he observed thoughtfully. But it was built upon a foundation of stolen genius and pursued through methods that violated every principle of ethical research. Perhaps it is fitting that such corrupted knowledge should perish with its appropriator. Lady Euphemia gathered her portfolio with renewed purpose. The remaining legitimate research will be placed with trustees who understand both scientific potential and moral responsibility. Mr. Holmes, Cornelius's death must not be entirely without meaning. As she departed into the London night, Holmes settled into his chair with evident satisfaction. Another case concluded. Watson, though this one revealed depths of human corruption that extend far beyond simple murder into the very heart of intellectual dishonesty. The pursuit of knowledge, corrupted by greed and vengeance. I reflected, considering the complex motivations that had driven both victim and perpetrators. Indeed, Holmes replied, reaching for his pipe. Science, like justice, demands integrity above all else. When that foundation crumbles, even the most brilliant discoveries become mere instruments of destruction. The quiet that settled over our Baker Street lodgings following Dr. Vance's arrest carried the weight of completed justice. Though Holmes remained at the window, his aquiline profile etched against the gaslight as he observed the fog-shrouded street below. The recovered strongbox sat upon our table like a monument to the corrupted ambitions that had driven men to murder, its brass fittings catching the firelight while the November wind rattled our windows with persistent urgency. Mrs. Hudson's familiar footsteps upon the stairs announced yet another visitor, though the hesitant quality of the accompanying tread suggested someone wrestling with considerable internal conflict. Josiah Peters entered our sitting room bearing the pallor of sleepless nights and the trembling hands of a man whose conscience had finally overcome his fear of consequences. Mr. Holmes, he began, his sandy lashes fluttering nervously as he wrung his cap between stained fingers. I can no longer remain silent regarding my role in these terrible events. The truth weighs upon me more heavily than any legal consequences I might face. Holmes turned from the window with that penetrating attention he reserved for crucial revelations, his grey eyes immediately noting the ink stains upon Peters's cuffs and the faint chemical odor that clung to his clothing. Pray be seated, Mr. Peters, and unburden yourself of whatever knowledge has so clearly disturbed your peace of mind. Dr. Vance approached me months ago, claiming concern for Professor Blackwood's deteriorating mental state. Peters continued, accepting the brandy I offered with evident gratitude. He offered substantial payment for detailed reports of the professor's daily routines, his experimental schedules, and his security arrangements. I believed I was helping to document a colleague's decline for his own protection. "Yet you came to understand the true purpose of this surveillance," Holmes observed, settling into his chair with that coiled intensity that marked his most focused investigations. When Timothy Marsh began his observations from the garret across the street, I realized that my reports had provided the foundation for something far more sinister. The precise timing of the professor's movements, his laboratory schedules, even his postal habits, all information I had innocently provided, was being used to plan his destruction. Holmes leaned forward, his fingers steepled in that characteristic pose. "And you chose silence over revelation, Mr. Peters. What finally compelled you to speak?" "The realization that my complicity extends beyond mere information gathering," Peters replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Dr. Vance instructed me to ensure that certain chemical supplies remained available in the laboratory, ostensibly for the professor's continued research. I now understand that these compounds, particularly the sal ammoniac, were essential components of the murder mechanism." The implications of Peters's confession struck me with chilling force. The conspiracy had penetrated even deeper into Professor Blackwood's daily existence than we had previously understood, with his own trusted assistant serving as an unwitting instrument of his destruction. Holmes rose and moved to examine the strongbox with renewed purpose. "Your cooperation in this matter demonstrates some measure of moral courage, Mr. Peters, though it comes regrettably late. Inspector Lestrade will require a complete statement detailing your involvement and the extent of Dr. Vance's instructions." "I understand, Mr. Holmes, and I am prepared to face whatever consequences my actions have earned. The professor, despite his faults, deserved better than betrayal from those he trusted." As Peters departed under police escort to provide his formal confession, Holmes returned to his contemplation of the recovered research materials. The manuscript of the Vigilant Principle lay open before him, its pages revealing theoretical insights that bordered upon revolutionary discovery, yet born from such morally corrupted foundations that their very brilliance seemed tainted. "The tragedy of this case, Watson," Holmes mused, his voice carrying that note of philosophical reflection that marked his deepest contemplations, "lies not merely in the loss of life, but in the corruption of scientific inquiry itself. Professor Blackwood's genius, however flawed by plagiarism and obsession, represented genuine advancement in understanding human consciousness. Yet the methods by which he pursued this knowledge, and the desperate measures others took to claim it, have transformed potential enlightenment into an instrument of destruction." I settled into my chair, considering the complex web of ambition, theft, and murder that had driven these tragic events. The pursuit of knowledge divorced from ethical constraint becomes a dangerous obsession, one that ultimately destroys both pursuer and pursued. Indeed, my dear fellow, Timothy Marsh possessed genuine brilliance, yet his resentment over stolen credit drove him to elaborate murder. Dr. Vance's legitimate scientific credentials were corrupted by greed and the desire for reflected glory. Even Professor Blackwood himself, the victim of this conspiracy, had built his reputation upon appropriated genius. Holmes closed the manuscript with evident distaste. Each participant in this tragedy believed themselves justified by noble scientific purpose, yet their actions revealed a profound moral bankruptcy that can lurk beneath intellectual achievement. The fire crackled in our sitting room as London's fog pressed against our windows, transforming the familiar city into a landscape as murky as the human motivations we had just unraveled. Holmes stood before the mantelpiece, his expression reflecting both satisfaction at another successfully concluded case and deeper concern for the broader implications of what we had discovered. The Vigilant Principle itself may indeed represent a genuine breakthrough in understanding consciousness and chemical stimulation, he continued thoughtfully. Yet its origins in academic fraud and its culmination in calculated murder serve as a profound warning about the responsibilities that accompany scientific discovery. Knowledge without wisdom, brilliance without ethics, these become not gifts to humanity, but curses upon those who pursue them. As the evening deepened around us, I reflected upon the intricate puzzle Holmes had once again solved through his unparalleled methods of observation and deduction. The case of the alchemist who never slept would undoubtedly take its place among our most intellectually challenging investigations. A testament not only to criminal ingenuity, but to the moral complexities that can corrupt even the noblest scientific pursuits. The morning following our arrests dawned with unseasonable clarity, as though London itself sought to cleanse away the moral fog that had shrouded our investigation. Holmes stood at our Baker Street window, observing the transformed cityscape with that penetrating attention he reserved for significant moments. While the recovered strongbox sat empty upon our table, its contents now distributed to their rightful claimants or consigned to the flames where corrupted knowledge belonged. Inspector Lestrade arrived, bearing news of complete confessions from both conspirators, his weathered features brightened by professional satisfaction. Marsh broke entirely when confronted with Vance's testimony, Mr. Holmes. The magistrate was particularly impressed by your reconstruction of the locked room mechanism, though he confessed himself baffled by 2024, the chemical complexities involved. Holmes beckoned me to the table where he had assembled a miniature reconstruction of Professor Blackwood's fatal laboratory. A spirit lamp, glass tubing, sal ammoniac, quicksilver in a sealed vial, and most curiously, a tumbler whose exterior he packed with crushed ice mixed with salt. Observe, Watson, the marriage of opposites that our alchemist referenced in his final letter, fire and ice enlisted to one deadly design. He kindled the lamp beneath the apparatus. Nearly invisible vapor traced through the tubing toward the artificially chilled tumbler, where it condensed into greasy smears at precisely the height we had observed on Professor Blackwood's laboratory windows. Mercury vapor, driven off by heat and concentrated by cold. The professor's own phrase was literal direction, not mystical metaphor. The window stains marked the vertical reach of the lethal atmosphere. I realized, understanding flooding through me with crystalline clarity. Precisely. Marsh cooled the lower window panes, while the heated apparatus created toxic mercury and carbon monoxide vapors. The professor's vigilant principal compounds, designed to maintain consciousness without sleep, became instruments of prolonged exposure to this deadly atmosphere. Holmes extinguished the demonstration with decisive precision. The locked room mechanism exploited Blackwood's own security tripwires, converting protective measures into imprisonment through the catgut system we discovered. And the postal deception. Marsh's masterstroke of misdirection. The iron gall ink instead of Blackwood's customary violet, the rehearsed tremor matching mercury poisoning symptoms, the smoky spectacles and mechanical movements all calculated to create an impossible timeline that placed death after the documented posting. Holmes settled into his chair with that air of philosophical reflection that marked our most profound cases. The tragedy lies not merely in murder, Watson, but in the systematic corruption of scientific inquiry itself. Timothy Marsh possessed genuine brilliance, yet legitimate grievances were perverted into elaborate vengeance. Dr. Vance's established reputation crumbled beneath his willingness to finance fraud and ultimately murder. Mrs. Hudson appeared with our afternoon tea, her maternal presence providing welcome contrast to the dark complexities we had unraveled. As she arranged the service with practiced efficiency, Holmes continued his analysis. Professor Blackwood's appropriation of younger colleagues' research created the very resentment that destroyed him. His white fire, the chemical acceleration of consciousness, became both his obsession and his executioner. The compounds meant to illuminate the mind's pathways instead consumed life itself. The most disturbing aspect, I observed, remains how thoroughly they exploited the victim's own character. Paranoia, his work habits, his chemical experiments, all weaponized against him. Indeed. The beauty of this crime lay in its exploitation of obsession itself. Yet observe how vanity betrayed the perpetrator's wrong ink, excessive thumbprints, rehearsed signatures that revealed their artificial nature. Such small departures from perfection become reason's greatest allies. Holmes reached for his violin, drawing forth a melancholy phrase that seemed to capture both the case's intellectual brilliance and moral corruption. Knowledge without wisdom, Watson, becomes not humanity's gift, but its curse. Science, like justice, demands integrity above all else. The Afternoon Post brought word of Lady Euphemia's scholarship fund, established to honor the legitimate researchers whose work Professor Blackwood had appropriated. Perhaps some measure of good might yet emerge from these tragic circumstances. As evening settled over Baker Street, Holmes set aside his instrument and reached for the morning correspondence. A baronet writes concerning his prize orchids, which appear to be dying under mysterious circumstances. It may provide a more wholesome puzzle for tomorrow's consideration. With characteristic dismissal of praise and transition to new mysteries, the great detective prepared to turn his unparalleled faculties toward whatever fresh enigmas London might provide, leaving the alchemist who never slept to join that quiet gallery of solved perplexities where human corruption meets inexorable justice.